Meeting Jenna felt like plugging into a live wire. She didn't just enter a room, she lit it up. Her presence was magnetic. Her laugh had the power to draw even strangers into its orbit. And her quick, clever remarks left most people trying to keep pace. Jenna wasn't merely attractive, she was the kind of person who naturally commanded attention without even trying. And I was completely drawn in. Honestly, I probably admired her more than anyone else, totally taken by the energy she brought into my world. When we got married, I believed I had found my forever person. I pictured us as this dynamic team, me offering stability while she brought in the spark and thrill. For a while, we worked well that way. Our contrasts seemed to strengthen each other, smoothing out the rough edges we both carried. But eventually, something shifted between us. At first, the changes were nearly invisible. The foundation began to crack in places I could easily brush off. Jenna had always had a playful, flirtatious nature. It was part of what made her so engaging. She could chat with anyone and make it feel special. I used to love that about her. But gradually, those harmless traits began to feel more pointed, less innocent. It started with little things. A look that lingered a bit too long on a waiter during a night out. A laugh that came off just a little too enthusiastic at someone else's joke. These moments, if taken individually, were easy to dismiss. But together, they began weaving a story I couldn't ignore. I'll never forget the first time I spoke up about it. We were at a party, and I saw her talking to a man I'd never met. They weren't physically close, but something about their body language, the tilt of her head, the intimate way she leaned in, hit me hard. My stomach tightened. Later that night, when we were finally alone, I brought it up. Jenna, what was going on back there? I asked. Her reaction was one of disbelief, like I'd just said something absurd. What are you talking about? She asked. You and that guy, I tried to explain. It just seemed like you two were really into whatever you were saying. She rolled her eyes, brushing it off like it was nothing. Come on, don't be ridiculous. He's just a friend. That phrase quickly became her default response. Anytime I voiced how her actions made me feel sidelined or uneasy, she'd laugh it off, call me jealous, or say I was being overly sensitive. Each time, I'd question myself, wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe I was reading too much into things. So I'd retreat from the conversation, pushing down the doubts and trying to convince myself I was overthinking everything. But those feelings never really left me. They just grew quieter, lingering in the back of my mind until something else triggered them again. What hurt the most wasn't her playful interactions with others, it was how she responded when I tried to be honest about how it made me feel. Instead of hearing me out, she'd reduce my concerns to punchlines. Ethan, you're so sensitive, she'd chuckle, shaking her head like it was endearing. But it didn't feel endearing. It felt dismissive. My hurt wasn't a joke, and it was starting to chip away at what we'd built together. Despite all this, I began wondering if the fault was mine. Was I expecting too much? Was I trying to make her into someone she wasn't? Maybe she really did just thrive on social interaction. And if that was the case, where did that leave me? I didn't want to become the kind of husband who dictated who his wife could talk to or how she should behave. That wasn't what I wanted in a relationship. But I also didn't want to feel invisible in my own marriage, like I was constantly watching her give her best self to everyone else while I waited on the sidelines. The moment everything came into sharp focus happened about a year after those thoughts first took root. We were at another one of those upscale events she adored. Crowded, loud, glamorous. Jenna was in her zone, effortlessly working the room. Meanwhile, I stood off to the side, holding a drink and trying not to look completely out of place. Then I saw her. She was across the room, laughing with a man I didn't recognize. It wasn't the laughter that got me. It was the way she looked at him. Like he was the most fascinating person she'd ever met. It was a look I hadn't seen directed at me in years. And that's when something inside me gave way. It wasn't quite anger, more like a deep, tired acceptance. This wasn't a fluke. This was how it had become, and it wasn't going to shift. Later that evening, during the ride home, I gave it one final attempt. My voice was calm, but carried the weight of everything I'd been holding in. Jenna, do you realize what's happening between us? I asked. She glanced at me, puzzled. What do you mean? I looked at her and said, You don't think I notice the way you act around other men? The way you light up for them while I sit there, barely a flicker in your world? There was silence for a moment. Then she gave a small smile and replied, "Oh, Ethan, you're imagining things." That phrase stuck with me. It was then I understood something crucial. Jenna wasn't going to change because she didn't see any need to. In her eyes, the problem didn't exist. It was just my perception, my imagination. Something for me to sort out, not her. I didn't utter another word that night. There simply wasn't anything left to say. Deep down, I understood something crucial. Our marriage was dangling by a fragile thread, and I wasn't the one holding the scissors anymore. Honestly, the evening had disaster written all over it from the moment we stepped inside. The event was held at a high-end hotel, the kind where the chandeliers alone probably cost more than my entire starting salary for a year. Jenna, naturally, looked absolutely radiant. She wore a form-fitting emerald green gown that seemed like it had been tailored just for her, and her hair was styled in that perfectly imperfect way that takes hours to achieve but looks effortless. She was glowing and completely aware of it. Meanwhile, I felt like more of a prop, there to round out the picture of her seemingly flawless life. As we entered the room, she lit up, her eyes sweeping across the crowd as if she were scanning for her next admirer. I stayed near her at first, going through the motions, shaking hands, smiling politely at strangers. But Jenna had already floated away into the social scene. That was how these events usually went. She would glide through the crowd, and I'd hang back, struggling to strike up conversations with other half-distracted attendees. But this night felt off. There was a subtle tension in the air, one I couldn't quite ignore. It didn't take long to understand why. He was there. I didn't recognize him, and honestly, it didn't matter. He stood tall, sharply dressed, with that air of unshakable confidence that only comes from never being told no. I spotted him by the bar, leaning casually against the counter, swirling a drink in his hand while surveying the crowd like he was choosing from a menu. And then his gaze settled on Jenna. She noticed almost immediately. A faint smile touched her lips as she casually tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was such a small movement, but I knew it too well. It was her silent signal, her way of saying, "Take notice." And he did. He definitely did. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it didn't mean anything. But as the evening unfolded, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something unfold right in front of me, something I was powerless to prevent. I found myself standing at one of the tall cocktail tables, quietly nursing my drink, my attention locked on Jenna as she mingled with Grace. She laughed, gestured with enthusiasm, completely in her element. Yet now and then, her eyes wandered back to that man at the bar, and he was watching her, not just observing, studying, like she was a fascinating puzzle he was eager to solve. Then came the moment when he decided to approach. It felt like time slowed. I watched him move through the room, cutting a path straight to her with calm certainty. Jenna turned toward him, her expression lighting up in a way that made my stomach knot. They exchanged a few words. Then she laughed. Not the forced kind she reserved for acquaintances, but a rich, full laugh I hadn't heard in months. A laugh that was just for him. I clenched my jaw and tried to stay composed. From a distance, nothing looked inappropriate. They weren't touching, and the interaction could have easily been mistaken for innocent conversation. But I knew her too well. I recognized the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes sparkled when she felt truly seen. And what hit me hardest was realizing that she was showing this stranger a side of herself I hadn't seen in a very long time. Eventually, I couldn't keep standing there and pretending it didn't matter. I made my way over to them, keeping my steps measured and my expression calm. As I approached, Jenna turned toward me and smiled, though there was something off about it, like the warmth didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, there you are, Ethan," she said brightly, as if nothing at all was wrong. "This is Lucas. He works in public relations." Lucas extended his hand with practiced ease. "Ethan," he said smoothly, "you've got an incredible wife here. She's been filling me in on your ventures. Very impressive." I took his hand, returning the handshake, though it felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Thanks," I replied, my voice flat. For a brief, awkward moment, the three of us stood in silence, an uncomfortable triangle of tension, until Jenna decided to break it. Lucas was just saying he's got some exciting ideas for helping you grow your client base, she said with enthusiasm laced through her words. I forced a tight smile. Maybe later. Actually, Jenna, I was hoping we could take a moment for ourselves. We haven't had a chance to talk all evening. Her smile faltered for a heartbeat, but returned quickly. Of course, she said, brushing her hand lightly against my arm. Excuse us, Lucas. As we walked away together, I leaned in close, lowering my voice. Do you really think I haven't noticed the way you keep looking at him? She stopped abruptly, turning toward me with a calm smirk that made my chest tighten with frustration. Then maybe you should pay close attention, she said coolly, because I'm just getting started. I stared at her, stunned. I had expected her to deny it, to wave it off like she usually did. But this was different. This was bold, a defiant version of her I didn't recognize. And it felt like a punch to the gut. I moved closer, speaking in a low, steady tone. Then here's something you should pay attention to, too. I'll be gone before the music stops playing. For a brief second, her smirk faltered, ever so slightly, but she quickly masked it with that same composed exterior. She laughed it off, brushing me aside just like she always did, and said I wasn't going anywhere. But this time, she was mistaken. That night, I stayed back and observed as Jenna moved through the crowd as if nothing had occurred. Her charm lit up the room. She was glowing, captivating, effortlessly pulling everyone's attention. But in my eyes, she seemed like a stranger. The woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone unfamiliar, someone I no longer felt compelled to fight for. By the end of the evening, my decision was made. The wake-up call hadn't been for Jenna. It had been for me. I realized I could no longer fool myself into thinking our relationship was salvageable. I had to stop pretending Jenna was still the person I believed she was. Walking to the car together, surrounded by silence, I experienced a strange sense of peace. I understood what needed to be done, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid to take that step. As we returned home from the event, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. Jenna had spent the entire drive glued to her phone, acting as though our earlier exchange hadn't happened. As if we hadn't traded words sharp enough to leave permanent damage. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind spiraling with thoughts I had kept buried for far too long. Once we were inside, she casually kicked off her heels and headed straight for the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of wine as though it were just another ordinary night. I stood in the doorway, watching her with quiet disbelief, half expecting her to bring up our argument. But she said nothing. Leaning against the counter, she twirled her wine and scrolled on her phone, completely detached. I stood there, frozen, overwhelmed by disbelief. Was this really how little she cared? About me? About us? Part of me wanted to demand answers, to confront her with the truth and force her to acknowledge what she had done. But another part of me, one that had grown weary from years of trying to keep our marriage together, just wanted to walk away. Finally, I spoke, my tone calm but weighted. You truly don't care at all, do you? She looked up, her face unreadable. Care about what? About everything. About this relationship, about how your actions have affected our marriage, about the way you've treated me. Jenna let out a sigh and placed her glass on the counter. Ethan, you're making this bigger than it is. I chatted with a guy at a party. That's hardly a scandal. It's not only about what happened tonight, I said, stepping further into the kitchen. It's the bigger picture. The constant flirting, the way you brush me off, the feeling that I'm just an afterthought when I'm supposed to be your husband. She rolled her eyes, her tone growing impatient. You're overreacting. Can't you just move past it? No, not this time, I said, my voice rising for the first time that night. I've looked the other way too many times. I've tolerated the way you behave around other men. I've swallowed my pride and stayed silent when you made me feel like I didn't matter. I've tried to talk, to fix things, to be patient. But it's clear now you've never really cared. Her eyes narrowed, and I caught a glimpse of something different in her gaze, maybe defensiveness. That's not fair, she responded, folding her arms. I've done plenty for us. Have you? I asked, more softly, but with just as much intensity. Because from where I'm standing, all you've done is take. You've taken my time, my effort, my love, and given back nothing. She opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, but no words came out. Her expression grew cold. Then she said, "You know what, Ethan? Maybe this marriage was just a mistake. Maybe we were never right together." Her words landed like a blow, but instead of weakening me, they brought clarity. She wasn't going to change. She wasn't going to put in the work. And I was finished sacrificing myself for someone who couldn't even admit there was a problem. "Maybe you're right," I said, my tone firm and emotionless. "Maybe it was a mistake, but here's the difference. I'm not going to keep making it." I turned and walked toward the bedroom. My hands trembled as I pulled a bag from the closet and began to pack. I didn't need much, just a few basics. Some clothes, toiletries, a handful of personal belongings. Everything else could stay behind. None of it held any meaning anymore. Jenna appeared in the doorway, her arms still crossed. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. "I'm leaving," I replied without looking at her. "I already told you back at the party. I'm done. Put on whatever act you want, but I won't be here to watch it anymore." She let out a laugh, but it was empty, lacking any real feeling. "You can't be serious." I zipped the bag shut and slung it over my shoulder. "I've never been more serious," I said, turning to face her. She stared at me for a long moment, disbelief etched across her face. Then something changed in her expression, something that looked a lot like fear. "Ethan, come on, you're blowing this way out of proportion. This is absurd." "No," I said, brushing past her and heading toward the front door. What truly stunned me was not the situation itself, but how long I had lingered, holding on to the hope that anything might shift. But nothing ever did. You stayed the same, unmoved and unchanged. I didn't pause to wait for a reply. I stepped through the door, letting it swing shut behind me with a sense of finality that felt strangely liberating, like an invisible weight had been taken off my shoulders. As I slid into the driver's seat and pulled away, I didn't feel rage or sorrow. Instead, a peculiar sense of peace settled over me, a bittersweet relief that marked the end of an exhausting chapter. I was done playing the role of her backup plan, her emotional crutch, or the one she turned to when everything else fell apart. At long last, I felt untethered. That night, I made a quiet but firm vow to myself. No more justifications, no more circular debates, no more trying to open the eyes of someone who had always refused to see. Jenna had a talent for warping our conversations, turning every heartfelt concern I raised into accusations of insecurity or claims that I was overreacting. But not this time. This time, I was stepping away before she even had the chance. It didn't take long for the messages to start pouring in. The first text arrived just as I parked outside the hotel I'd chosen for the night. "Ethan? Seriously? Where are you? Come home so we can talk." I didn't respond. There was nothing more to explain, and honestly, I doubted I could stay calm if I tried. I powered off my phone, tossed it onto the desk in my hotel room, and let my body collapse onto the bed. A strange mix of wariness and peace washed over me. By the time morning rolled around and I turned the phone back on, it immediately lit up with a barrage of messages. Some were annoyed, others desperate, and a few simmered with frustration. "You're acting like a child. I didn't do anything wrong, and now you're making a huge scene. Ethan, stop this. We need to talk." Still, I kept my silence. Every word she sent only reinforced the decision I'd made to walk away. Her messages weren't apologies. They were attempts to regain control, to return things to the way she preferred them, unbalanced and on her terms. 3 days passed, and the tone of her texts began to shift. The arrogance and irritation faded, replaced by something that sounded a lot more like desperation. "Ethan, I'm sorry, okay? Can we please just talk? I swear I'll listen this time." That word, listen, might have meant something a few months ago, but now it just rang empty. She had more than enough opportunities to listen before. She had countless chances to understand how deeply her actions affected me, to show that our relationship actually mattered to her. But she hadn't. And now those moments had slipped away for good. As more days drifted by, her messages came less often, but carried more emotional weight. "I miss you. Please, don't do this. We can fix it. I know we can." But instead of satisfaction, I felt something closer to quiet sorrow. Not for myself, but for the potential we'd lost. For everything we could have become if she'd only chosen to care before the damage became irreversible. Eventually, word about Jenna's reaction started trickling in through people we both knew. One afternoon, my phone lit up with an unexpected call from Tom, a mutual friend. "Ethan, man," he said gently. "I ran into Jenna recently. She told me what happened." "Oh, really?" I said, my voice flat and unreadable. "Yeah," he replied, treading carefully. "She's not handling things too well, says she doesn't understand why you left, claims it came out of nowhere." That made me laugh, short and bitter. "Out of nowhere? Seriously?" Tom hesitated, then added, "She's definitely painting the picture like you just walked out one day, no warning. But I told her, Ethan's been going through this for a long time." "She didn't want to hear that, did she?" I asked, shaking my head. "No, not really," he admitted. "But maybe you should think about giving her some kind of closure?" "Closure?" I echoed, genuinely stunned. "Tom, I spent years trying to talk to her, to fix what was breaking, to get her to acknowledge any of it. She didn't care then, so why should I believe she does now?" Tom couldn't respond, and honestly, neither could I. Weeks passed, and her messages slowed to a trickle. Occasionally, late at night, I'd get one that felt raw and unguarded. "I don't know how things ended up like this. I miss us. I'm sorry." But by then, it was all too far gone. Her apologies felt more like a way to ease her own conscience rather than a real effort to make amends. It seemed like she was seeking forgiveness for herself, not trying to repair the damage. I didn't bother blocking her number. There wasn't any need. Not responding wasn't about payback. It was about preserving the progress I'd made. Each message from her felt like a tug at a thread I'd worked so hard to sever. I wasn't going to let her undo that healing. One evening, I sat quietly on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights shimmer below. My phone buzzed beside me, and I glanced at the screen. Her name appeared again. For a brief second, I considered picking up, but instead I sighed and let it ring through to voicemail. I didn't need to hear her voice to know what she would say. The same explanations, the same vows, the same empty reassurances that had once kept me chained in place for far too long. But that person, the one who waited, was gone. I had finally stopped expecting Jenna to become someone she was never willing to be. It was finally time to turn inward and focus on transforming myself. The days and weeks after I moved out carried an odd combination of relief and unease. On one side, there was this lightness, as if I'd shrugged off a heavy burden. I no longer had to put up with Jenna's cold indifference or live with the constant sting of being an afterthought in my own marriage. But on the other hand, I had stepped into unfamiliar territory. For such a long stretch of time, my existence had revolved around being her husband, fighting for us, and endlessly attempting to mend what was broken. Now, for the first time in years, I had to imagine a version of life that didn't include her. I settled into a modest apartment located downtown. It was small, a single bedroom, some basic furnishings, and a window that overlooked the parking lot. But it was entirely my space. No shared drawers, no traces of Jenna's style in every corner, no lingering arguments echoing in the air. Just a blank canvas to start over. I unpacked slowly, intentionally, and found an odd comfort in the simplicity of it all. My job became a kind of refuge. I dove headfirst into work, often staying late, tackling assignments I had been avoiding for months. Sure, part of me was keeping busy to avoid the pain, and I won't deny that. But more than that, I was trying to regain a sense of stability, to prove to myself that I could thrive without leaning on anyone else. People at work started to notice something different in me. One day, during a break, a coworker commented that I seemed more driven lately. I simply replied that I had fewer distractions to deal with now. It wasn't much, but it was the truth. Beyond the office, I started reaching back out to friends I hadn't seen in what felt like ages. During our marriage, Jenna's whirlwind social calendar always seemed to take over, and somewhere along the way, I'd allowed my own friendships to fade into the background. But now, I began reconnecting, grabbing a coffee here, catching up over a drink there, and I rediscovered the value of those connections that had quietly waited for me. Mark, one of my oldest friends, eventually talked me into joining him for a weekend hike. He said I needed a break from the city, a mental reset. I was hesitant. Hiking had never been something I enjoyed, but I agreed. And he was absolutely right. Standing on a cliff's edge, surrounded by nothing but forests and sky, I experienced a calm I hadn't felt in years. The chatter in my mind quieted down, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind. It reminded me how vast the world was, how small my problems seemed in comparison, and that life continued even after the storms. That moment became a catalyst. I began carving out time for myself in new ways. I took up jogging, finding relief in the rhythm of each step and the dull ache in my legs. I enrolled in a cooking class and learned to prepare meals that didn't come in cardboard containers. I even started reading again. Not self improvement books, just good old fashioned stories that pulled me into different worlds and made me forget everything else. Meanwhile, Jenna's life appeared to be spinning out of control. I didn't actively seek updates, but they still reached me through mutual acquaintances and the occasional social media posts that slipped through. One afternoon, Tom mentioned over coffee that she wasn't doing so well. He'd seen her at a party and said it was nothing like the Jenna he used to know. She no longer had that same spark, that ability to capture a room's attention effortlessly. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me felt a strange sense of justice. She was finally confronting the reality she'd ignored for so long. But another part, the one that still held on to memories of the person I fell in love with, felt a soft sadness. Not exactly sympathy, but something close. The stories didn't stop there. Jenna had thrown herself into an even more chaotic social life, hoping perhaps to distract herself or fill a void. But the charm that once drew people in now seemed forced. Friends who had once hung on her every word were starting to drift away, worn down by the constant drama and need for validation. Without me around to offer balance or clean up the messes, her world was slipping further out of her hands. Then came the texts. They arrived less often now, but when they did, they carried a raw, unfiltered tone. She wrote things like, "I don't know how to do this without you," and "everything feels wrong." Sometimes, she'd say she missed what we had and begged me to respond. I never did. Not out of bitterness. I had loved her deeply, to the point it nearly broke me. But I understood that replying wouldn't heal either of us. Just as I had to face the truth about our relationship, she needed to face hers. Some connections, once severed, just can't be pieced back together. One day, I received a call from someone who used to be close to her. The voice on the line was soft, but urgent. She explained that Jenna wasn't doing well, that she didn't seem like herself anymore, and maybe hearing from me might help. I kept my response calm and polite. I thanked her for letting me know, but explained that I didn't think reaching out would do any good. Jenna had to navigate her path alone now. There was a pause, then a sigh, one of resignation, not surprise. The caller simply said she understood and thought I should be aware. The truth is, hearing that Jenna was struggling didn't bring me any happiness, and it didn't offer any closure either. That moment served as a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between us, of all that we had both sacrificed along the way. Yet it also affirmed a lesson I had been slowly coming to terms with since the moment I left. I wasn't her savior. I couldn't mend what was broken within her. My only real option was to focus on my own healing and hold on to the hope that, eventually, she might find her own path forward. Later that evening, as I sat quietly in my apartment with the city lights stretching out before me, something finally clicked. Jenna's downward path was no longer mine to shoulder. I didn't need to be the one trying to catch her every time she stumbled. What I needed was to stay committed to my own journey, to the fresh start I was carving out, to the person I was slowly becoming. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that realization brought peace.